Mm-hmm.
I'll share it again. Okay, so we'll start. We're actually on Yud Beis Amud Aleph, and we are up to the Gemara. This is Omer Chanan Rebbelatri. So let's just review. The Mishnah just told us that if someone had nechosim, and amongst his nechosim, he had animals that were kosher for karbanis, zechorim that were tmimim, and nekevis that were tmimim, and he said that all of my nechosim should go to hektish. Rabbi Eliezer said that you sell these animals l'tzorich karbanis, but the money goes to bedek habayis, and your Yeshua says that the males, the zechorim, can actually be brought as karbanis. The Gemara quoted a brisa that says that stam hektish is lebedek habayis. So on that, the Gemara says, Rab Chananya, the Rabbi Eliezer, the brisa that says that stam hektish goes lebedek habayis is following the shita of Rabbi Eliezer. The Taninan, because we learned in our Mishnah, hamaktish nechasav, if one is maktish is nechasim, v'hoysa behen behema ru'uya al gabe mizbeach zechor munikevis, and he had animals that are ready to be brought on the mizbeach. Rabbi Eliezer Eimer zechor mimachar l'tzorcher oilos unikevis yimachar l'tzorcher zichur shlamim u'demeim yiplu imshar nechasim lebedek habayis. So you see, it's Rabbi Eliezer who holds that stam hektish is lebedek habayis, because according to Rabbi Shua, you're actually makir of those animals on the mizbeach themselves. So Rabbi Shua holds that stam hektish wouldn't necessarily be lebedek habayis.
First time I've ever seen Reb Eliezer spelled without Eliezer.
We had it a couple of times. In the Masechta.
Is this so? This is unique to the Yerushalmi.
I think so. I've never seen it in Bavli.
It's like a Swedish thing.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So Amr B'Yechanan, time of Rabbi Eliezer, the Sfor of Rabbi Eliezer, it says in the pasuk, the ish ki yaktish is based on kodesh l'Hashem. It says in the pasuk, let's quote the whole pasuk. If someone is in Makdish's house, so clearly those are nechasim, they're not karbanis. It says v'aricha akoyin bein toiv u'bein ra kashiyarch oisei akoyin kein yovel. So Zok to Gemara, what is this pasuk referring to? Zok to Gemara, b'ma'anan chayam. What is this pasuk referring to? In beveis dira, if it's talking literally about being Makdish your home, kfar ksiv, the pasuk discusses the halacha of someone who's Makdish's home. It says in Makdish yigalas beisa. So the pasuk here must be referring to something else. It must be talking about somebody who is Makdish's nechasim. So I'm just going to jump into the Goyse Grove. So you see from here that Stam Hektish is lebedek habayis. So this is the pasuk that Rabbi Yochanan, that Rabbi Eliezer would rely on in paskening that Stam Hektish is lebedek habayis. Rab Zira, Rav Chuna b'Shem Rav, v'mepligen. We have a machlokes between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Shua if the animals are brought on the mizbech, like Rabbi Shua says, or if the animals are used, you sell them to people who want to bring karbanis, but the actual money goes to lebedek habayis. The Zok Gemara, v'mepligen. In what case is Rabbi Eliezer, and Rabbi Shua arguing? The makdish nechasim. If someone said I makdish all my nechasim, which included both bedek habayis items that can only be used for bedek habayis, like gold, silver, as well as animals that are royal to be brought up in mizbeach. Al the makdish edrei. But if you only makdish animals that are royal to be brought up in mizbeach, kol amamoidi shulam mizbeach. There, maybe even Rabbi Eliezer would agree that you are makriv those animals on the mizbech. You don't mean bedek habayis. Rabbah, Rav Chuna b'Shem Rav, Mapligin, he says fakert. Where's the machlokes? The makdish edrei. The machlokes of Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua is if you're makdish only animals. It means even Rabbi Yeshua, who holds, so even Rabbi Eliezer, who holds that it's bedek habayis, that's even if you're makdish, you're eder alone. But if you're makdish nechosim and in amongst your nechosim, some of them are animals, kol ama moidi shula bedek habayis. Even Rabbi Yeshua would agree that it's the bedek habayis.
Okay.
Now, the Tatlin speaks out that if you look at the Mishnah, it'll be a little bit shverlich the loshen, because it says over here, hamakdish nechosim b'hoya behen behemaruya agav mizbeach. It's hard to learn that this means that there are only behemoths.
Right. That it was
The reading of the Mishnah is among the nechosim were behemoths.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's see the Gemara about it.
What does he do with that? He just points it out?
Yeah, let's look inside where he actually says it. He says over here, "Will the day tzarch leimar the loitani im shar nechosim b'masnisim." You have to say that. You have to say you're not gershon. Okay. We're learning now that the machlokes is a lekah shar nechosim pli. But in the Gemara Tamura, it says that shita won't be able to be gershon.
Right.
So zok to Gemara. Al data der b'zira nicha. According to B'zira, it's very gishma. Rabbi Zira said that they're arguing by Makish Nechosov, but the Makish Edrei Kol Avoid. But the problem is, Al Data de Rava, and let's look at the Gra. Al Das de Rava Kasha, if you learn that the Machlokes is, even if you specifically were only Makish your behemoths, and even there, that even there, Rabbi Eliezer holds as Labedek Abayis, Kasha, Behema, Loilim Mizbeachi, wouldn't a Behema, if you're Makish a Behema, wouldn't everybody agree that if you're Makish a Behema at the time, that it automatically means a carbon? That would be the Stam Das of a person. So to Gemara, Behema Lemizbeach, Oimer Lemizbeach. If a person wants to donate his Behema to a carbon, he would have actually said in his being Makish that it's Lemizbeach. Why did the person just say it should be for Hektish? And he didn't say it should be Lemizbeach. Shehuka Omer, it's as if someone beferish speaks out, Lo Yiyah Ela Lebedek Habayis. The normal way to be Makish Behema holds Rabbi Eliezer is to say it's Lemizbeach. Since you just said Stam Shel Hektish, that's like specifying that you only want it to be for Bedek Habayis. Rabbi Yechon Amar, Lo Shan Yehi, doesn't make a difference. The machlokes is sai if someone was only makish behemis, and sai if someone was makish all of the person. Lo shani, he ha makish nechasov, he ha makish edroi, he ha machlokes. So we have a three-way machlokes pshat in the Mishnah. Is the machlokes only if you were makish your eder alone? Is it only if you were makish all your nechasov and amongst them was animals, or is it by both? What happens if you have kotche by the kabayis? So you referish makish animals by the kabayis, and they were tamimim. These are animals that did not have a moon. So the halacha is if you report them yotzu l'chul, those animals go l'chul. Masnitz and we have a Mishnah that says this. And let's look at the Zion where this Mishnah is. The Mishnah is in Chulin, Kuflamet. And the Mishnah says, if you point an animal, V'lodon v'chelbon muter la'acher pejoinen. The v'lod and the chelaf are muter la'acher pejoinen. The v'lod and the milk and the cholaf are muter la'acher pejoinen. So you see, it goes in Gans and Chulin. The Taklan asks that the Mishnah is not speaking about a case of Bedek Habayis that you reported to me. The Mishnah is speaking about a case of an animal that had a mum that you were makish l'shem carbon. An animal that had a mum that you were makish l'shem carbon, meaning the animal could never have been brought as a carbon. That animal, you say, is v'lodon v'chol v'mutal achapiyonim. How do you see that an animal of Bedek Habayis is the same? So the Taklan is a long shtickle, but he says the Gemara holds that an animal that you were marked specifically for a carbon, even though it had a mum, if that's considered mutar lacha pidyonon, and the animal that you're makdish for bedek abayis should for sure be mutar la'acha pidyonon. It should be in ganzen chulin. There's no restrictions on it.
And that animal, because it had a mum, goes to bedek habayis, right? Even though he said it was lekarbonoi.
No. If you're makdish an animal, then it's sold, and then the money is used to buy a korban.
Well, keep in mind. So again, do we hold like zeira that the proper lingo is to say karbonoi or to be makdish? Is that an accepted way?
You want to know if we're following Rabbi Yochanan over here?
Yeah.
Yeah, we're following Rabbi Yochanan. Because if you're not following Rabbi Yochanan, it's a korban. Right? We're trying to say if you hold it goes to the Kabayis, and if you point it, it's in ganzen chulin.
But it can't be a korban because it has a mum.
No, in our Mishnah we're discussing if you were makdish lebedek abayis, an animal that was a tam.
Right. Okay.
And we're saying that an animal that was
that's
a tam.
our Mishnah. Our Mishnah here.
Correct.
Right. So, but that Mishnah over there is talking about a behemoth with a mum, right?
But you were makdish it specifically shema korban.
Right. So that automatically will not be a korban because it's got a mum.
It itself won't be brought as a korban, but when you sell it, the money that you get is used to purchase an animal that you're going to bring for a korban. It doesn't go to bedek habayis. But we have to talk about an animal to makdish bedek habayis.
Right. And do we say that a person when he's makdish has to say that he's makdish likarbonai or just stam hek?
According to Rabbi Eliezer, the way we're learning, yes, you have to speak out the bedek habayis because otherwise,
automatically
actually you don't have to speak out the bedek habayis. We just said a moment ago that the fact that I didn't say lemizbeach means bedek habayis. Right, that's what we said in the Rabbi Eliezer.
Okay.
So let's see what the Gemara says. Reb Chizkiya, the Shem Reb Chisda, he argues, and he says you can't bring a raya from there that if you were pointed by the kabayis, that at the time it would go chulin and ganzen, because you could say tifaser. Let's see the gra. Tifaser. Let's see the aleph. Tifaser shehumamu upad. The same way that Mishnah that we just quoted is speaking, even though it was donated for a korban, but we say that until it has a mum, it's not golden l'chulin. Maybe you can argue that even if it's bedek habayis, if it was roy to be brought as a korban, it wouldn't be chulin unless it actually had a mum. And Rabbi Yosef Shem Reb Chisda wants to bring a raya that in fact, even if it was a bedek habayis animal, but it was roy for a korban, it only goes to chulin in ganzen if it has a mum, because there's a Mishnah that Reb Chisda quotes. Mastis Namarke. The Mishnah says, "Lodon v'chelbon aser la'acher pejoinon," and the Mishnah finishes off. Again, we have to look at the gra. That Mishnah finishes off and says, "Masha einkein b'kotche bedek habayis." So it says clearly that by an animal that you were makdish and it had a mum, that animal, after you appointed the vlad and the chalov is also masha enkein by kotche bedek habayis, it will be mutter after pejoinim. But it means by kotche bedek habayis, after it had a mum and after it had a pigeon, only there do you say vlad and the chalov aser. So I want to correct myself. This Mishnah is speaking about an animal that you were makdishit for a korban when it was a tam. Then it got a mum, and then you were pointed. That animal is called psulahem ekdoshim sheniftu, and it's vladis and its cholov is also. You're only allowed to shecht it for its meat. Masha enkein, the Mishnah says, if it was kotze v'ekabayis, then after it has a mum, after it's nifta, it would be chulin and ganzen, and you could even use its children, or you could even use its milk. But I'll call upon them this process seems to support that even though it was kotche bedek habayis, until it gets a mum and you're pointed, it wouldn't be chulin and ganzen. Frek the Gemara, Chizki b'shem Rabbi Yosef asked the following question: Kotche bedek shepadon tmimin, yotzu l'chulin. You can't say that kosher bedek abayis won't be chulin unless it actually has a mum. And I'll bring you a raya from our Mishnah. Because in Tamar, lo yotzu l'chulin, if you're going to argue that kosher bedek abayis that are tmimin don't go l'chulin, heich kosher mizbech chulin al kosher bedek abayis. We learned in our very Mishnah that says, according to Rabbi Eliezer, you take these animals, they're bedek abayis, you sell them to people who want to bring them as karbanis. If they're male animals, you sell them to people who want to bring a carbon oila. If they're female animals, you sell them to people who want to bring a carbon shlamim. And the animals will become karbanis when you sell them to those people. But if these animals have a kedushas bedek abayis and they don't go l'chulin, how is it possible for these animals to become karbonos when you sell them? They were kosher bedek abayis, and unless they go ganzen l'chulin, how could you possibly sell them? So the next words of the Gemara, the teretz to this kasha, is very elusive. The ArScroll says that there's no shot that we have here on the Omid that fits in beautifully. He brings down from the Rivavon, I think, who only according to him will this Gemara make sense, but the way he learns is, and it doesn't fit so good into the words, he says as follows: Zok Gemara, Bale Mumin Kochem Mizbech Cholalim. This that we're saying that even if they don't have a mum, they go l'chulun, and therefore you could sell them. But we also say that bedek abayis, unless it has a mum, the kedusha remains on it. That's only a gzered dirabban. The din of kedusha that it retains, that we've discussed, that the Chisda held of, that din of kedusha that it has isn't really a deraisadika kedusha that remains on it. It's just a dirabban, the kedusha, a chomer that we put on it. Laidamila, l'maydafkamina lagabe. What does it have a kedusha? Zok to gra. The foster lagizu lavod. All it means is if you have an animal, a bedek abayis, and you point it, and there was a tam, it will still be osir for giza avoda. It'll only be able to be used for its meat. But the price are really gans and chulin once you're plated, and therefore a Mishnah makes sense why you could sell it to anybody who wants to buy it for the purposes of either bringing it as an oila if it's a male animal, or bringing it as a shlomim, it's a female animal.
I'm afraid you lost me over here. We had a question how it could be that how you would be able to sell these animals, these zchorim, these nekevis to people if it's already hektish. If it's already hektish, how could it go out?
Even though normally bedek abayis you could sell to anybody, and then the bedek abayis goes l'chulin. But if you're going to say it retains a kedushas, a carbon,
even though it's bedek abayis, right?
We're
talking about right. So if you're going to say that these bedek abayis behemoths retain
the kedushas aguf, some level of kedushas aguf, how could you sell it to a third party as a carbon?
Okay, but even though you're selling it to a third party, they are bringing it as a carbon. It's
correct.
But they can only bring a carbon that was at one time chulin. Is that the problem?
That's right. They have to buy a chulin animal. They can't buy a carbon that's already a carbon.
Okay, so now that we established the question again, then what is the answer? What's the continuation of the Gemara?
The answer is that we said until now, that we brought a right from Mishnayos, that kedushas bedek abayis retains kedusha even after you're poided until it gets a mum. That's only midrabban. Midaraisa, it doesn't have any kedusha at all. So therefore, you can easily sell it, and it can be used as a carbon.
Okay, so that's simple.
Yeah. So frankly, hifrish nekeva loyla say ulapischai ulasha. We know a carbon oil has to be a male animal. Your carbon pesach has to be a male animal, and your asham has to be a male animal. And someone was mafresh and a kefa. He said, "This should be my oila, harezu oila, harezu carbon pesach, harezu asham." So of course it doesn't work. and you'd have to sell it. But you have to wait till it's a mum, and then you would sell it. But the shaila is, does it have any level of kedusha shaguf? And what if I made a tamura? So what if I took this animal and said, I raised oila, it was in the cave, it can't be brought as an oila. Could I bring a male animal near it and say, Zu tamura su? Of course, it's also to make a tamura. And of course, even if you make a tamura, the original animal retains its kedusha, but the question is, would it even work? Would it even work? In other words, maybe the animal wouldn't even get any level of kedusha shaguf whatsoever, because in the cave it can't be an oila.
Didn't you tell me that an akeva could be a shlomim?
Yes, but we're talking about someone who is mafresh for an oila, his pesach, or zoshim.
And a pesach is not a shlomim?
That's a very good point, and the Gemara is going to bring it up, but a korban pesach is not a shlomim. A korban pesach could only be a male, although a shlomim could be a female.
Okay.
So the Gemara is going to raise soon that since a pesach could be a shlomim, maybe it's good enough. And we're going to discuss that a little bit later. That's a very good point you're bringing up. So the halach is oiseh tamura. The Tanakama holds that even though it's not a good carbon, but it gets some level of kedusha shaguf that you can actually make a tamura with this animal. Again, we're not saying that it's mutter to do. We're saying it would work if you did it. Rab Shimon Omer, la'ilasa oiseh tamura. The oila has a shaychus to becoming kodesh, even though it's in the keva, and we're going to soon discover why. But lapischay l'shamay has no shaychus to being in the keva, and therefore, ein oiseh tamura, it will get no kedusha at all. The Kanaka Tamur. Rab Shimon ben Yehuda, Omer Mishum Rab Shimon. So we have the Tanakama's opinion of what Rab Shimon said, and now we have Rab Shimon ben Yehuda's comments. How he understood Rab Shimon was la oilasai ula pischai ula shame ein oiseh tamur. Neither one gets any type of kedusha at all, and the keva cannot be these karbanis, and therefore it puts no kedusha onto it whatsoever, no kedusha zaguf onto it whatsoever, and therefore can make a tamur. So we have
the word neither. The word neither could be used for to address three items. When you say
just two items,
I'm asking you. I think so. No,
could be. I don't know.
Okay, fine.
But Shimon saying that neither of these things could get any level of kedusha.
None of them.
So the Tanakama holds that they all get kedusha. Rab Shimon, the Tanakama says they all get kedusha. Rab Shimon says only the oila gets kedusha, and Rab Shimon ben Yehuda and Rab Shimon said nothing gets kedusha.
Okay.
Amar b'echad. Time with Rab Shimon. What is the svar of Rab Shimon, who says that the oila, even though an oila can't be in the keva, it gets some level of kedusha and it'll be oiseh tamur. What's the svar? Zok the Gemara. Shekein matzinu nekeva ba'oif kshera lavai oila, because an keva has a shaychus to an oila. Where does an keva have a shaychus to an oila? Had you not been mafresh a behema, rather if you were mafresh a bird, if the bird was in the keva, it would have been a good carbon. So since there's some small shaychus for a kedushas oil to be chalal in the keva, we'll say that even though you wrongly were mafresh a behema in the keva for an oil, it'll get some level of kedusha so that you could make it tamur.
Got it.
V'amar b'yechanan, Talmid Rab Shimon ben Yehuda, the svar of Rab Shimon ben Yehuda in the name of Rab Shimon, who held that nothing becomes kaddish at all, and he says his svar is the following: Min b'minay hu chalak alav. Even if it was the right min, Rab Shimon holds it gets no level of kedusha, and we'll illustrate where he says that. Surely, if it's the wrong gender, if it's a female in the cave instead of a zocher, surely it would have no level of kedusha at all.
Is that? I never knew that a nekev and a zocher is called two different meaning. That's new to me.
That's how the Gemara is referring to it over here.
Okay,
because it's not really crucial species. Yeah,
right. It's crucial that the Gemara is using that over here.
Yeah,
okay.
So, Ezo min b'minoi shehu chalak alav. Where do you find where Rab Shimon holds that even if it's the same min, even if it's the same gender, it will still not have kedusha? Kadot etani, like we learned, and let's once again jump into the Vilna Gaon because it's very relevant. His girsa, Asham ben Shana. What happens if you had an Asham? There's different types of Ashamas. There's Asham Gzelis, Asham Milos, Hashem Cheshivcha Charufa, Hashem Nazar, Hashem Tzar, Hashem Tali. Now, there are certain Hashemis, I think the Hashem Gzelos has to be 1 year old. So Hashem ben Shana, Vevi ben Stein. So he brought a male, but he brought a male that was the wrong age. Or ben Stein, Vevi ben Shana. Or it was an Hashem that needed to be 2 years old, and he brought 1 year old. The loch is kosher, it's kosher. That's what the Tanakh holds. It's a kosher carbon. Rab Shimon Omer called Atam in the Kaddish. So Rab Shimon holds, even if it was a male and it was the right gender, which we're referring to as the right min, but if it was merely the wrong age, it's totally disqualified and it gets no kedusha at all. So the Gemara is arguing. Rab Shimon says, even if it was a male just the wrong age, it gets no kedusha at all. Surely, if it's a female and it's supposed to be a male, surely it should have no kedusha at all. Now, just as a trivia, so we know which hashamis have to be 1 year old and which ones have to be 2 years old. We'll quickly run into the Taklin, and he says it over here. Asham ben Beishanim is Asham Gezelos and Me'ilos and Shivcha Charufa, and the Asham ben Shana would be an Asham Nazar and an Asham Mitzayir. So out of the 5 Hashamis, 2 of them are supposed to be 1 year old, and 3 of them are supposed to be 2 years old. So Rab Shimon holds if it's even merely the wrong age, that's enough to say it's not going to have any kedusha at all. So Kol Shekain, if you were mafresh, a female for an oila, surely it should get no kedusha at all. Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Rab Shimon and Rabbi Yeshua, Rab Shimon, who we know who Rab Shimon is, we just learned Rab Shimon, who says that it doesn't get any kedusha at all if it's the wrong gender. None of these karbanos would have any kedusha. For Rabbi Yeshua in our Mishnah, who says that your makriv, the oilus, the male as oilus, and the nekevish you sell, shneim amru davar echad. They both hold of the same Allah. How do you see that? Kamod Rabbi Yeshua amru. What did Rabbi Yeshua say? If someone was mafresh his nechasim, and there were animals that were tamimim, some of them were nekevis, and some of them were zcharim. So what does Rabbi Yeshua say? Nekeva lo oila lo kitcha. What did Rabbi Yeshua say? That the nekevis don't get a kedusha to go for an oila, ela hektish domim. They only get a hektish domim. Rabbi Yeshua said, even though if it was a male animal, you actually are makriv on the mizbeach itself. If it was a female animal, you have to sell it. So you see, Rabbi Yeshua makes that distinction that a korban, that an animal that you want to bring as a korban, because Rabbi Yeshua holds that your stam das, when you're being makdish an animal of the tam, is for a korban. Since it's not the right gender, it won't get any kedusha saguf at all. Ken Rab Shimon Amar nekeva la'oila la'kitcha la'hektasham. So to Rab Shimon, according to Rab Shimon ben Yehuda, who holds that even the oila that you were makriv, that you were mafresh as a nekeva, it would get no kedusha at all. Im Tamer, Kacha Kedushas Aguf, because if in fact that it got Kedushas Aguf, according to Rabbi Yeshua, you shouldn't just be able to sell it for somebody who wants to buy a shlamim. You'd have to let it get a mum, because it should have Kedushas Aguf. Omer Rabbi, Ani Raya es Divi Rab Shimon bePesach. Now, the Girsa here changes, and it's Ein Ani Raya es Divi Rab Shimon bePesach. So the first shita in Rab Shimon was Lailasai. I'm sorry, the first shita in Rab Shimon was Lailasai Oisat Tamura, but Lepitzcha Lashoma in Oisat Tamura. And we learned the oila has a shaykhis to being in the cave, because if it was an oif, it would be kosher within the cave. But the Pesach and the Oshim have no shaykhis to being in the cave. Chaim Tzvi asked, what are you talking about? A Pesach is going to be brought as a shlomim after Pesach, and the shlomim could be in the cave. So why don't you say it by Pesach as well? And the cave has a shaykhis to being a korban Pesach, and therefore it should be Oisat Tamura. And that's exactly what Rebbe's taina was. Zok Rebbe, Amar Rebbe, Ein Ani Roya is Divrei Rab Shimon bePesach. I don't agree with what Rab Shimon said by Pesach, that it cannot be, it does not have any kedusha, that it does not have any kedusha if it's in a cave. So let's have a look over here. Ein Ani Roya is Divrei Rab Shimon bePesach. Shamoisha Pesach bar Shlomim, just like Chaim Tzvi suggested, that a carbon Pesach, if it's not brought on Erev Pesach, in fact, it will become a shlomim. So if it will become a shlomim, and the shlomim could be in the keva, so let's say it has enough of a shaykhis that it should get kedusha, and just like the oila, since it could be brought in the keva by an oif, it's considered kedushas aguf. Say the same thing by the carbon Pesach. If that's what you want to argue, Rebbe, that it's enough of a shaykhis, if the fact that the Pesach could become a shlomim could be in the keva, that should be enough for the female Pesach to get some kedushas aguf. Well, he should say the same thing by an asham, because the asham also has a shaykhis. Why? If you have an extra asham, it's yirat yistavu, and then with the money you bring a carbon oila. So the extra of asham is brought as an oila, and once you tap into the oila track, we know that an oila, if it was an oif, could be brought in the keva. So maybe that's enough of a connection that there should be a kedushas aguf on this nekeva that was wrongly set aside as an osham, that was set aside of a Pesach. Omar Abin, there's a very big difference. Why Rebbe would only argue by a carbon Pesach, where it's close enough to being in the keva, that's why you should have a kedusha, but not by an osham. Why? Because in Hikdish Pesach, ba shlomim guve karav shlomim. The carbon Pesach, in itself, can be brought as a carbon shlomim. That's a pretty close connection to a shlomim, enough that we should argue that the carbon Pesach that was hufresh as in the keva should be kadosh. But in Hikdish Asam ba'oila, that we said that an asham could become an oila if it's redundant, if it's an extra asham, for instance, you found a different animal and you got a kapara from there, ain gufei karavoid. Never will the actual animal that you was supposed to be an asham, never will that be brought as an oila. It's only once it gets a mum, you'll buy an oila with its money. That's not close enough to argue that the asham has shaykhis to an nekeva. Let's see what the Hay says. Mapli, what's the difference? And there's two pshatim in this, but we'll learn the first pshat of the top. What's the difference between Rebbe, who says only by the carbon Pesach he wants to suggest it should have a connection to an oila, to a nekeva, but he argues and says that an asham should have no shaykhus to an oila. Yet the Gemara asked that you should say the same thing like an asham as well. So the Gemara Amar hektish mal kedai hahein Amar hektish damim hektish. Rebbe would say that that's merely hektish damim when you were makriv, when you were mafresh on the keva for an asham. It's only its damim that could ever come to being brought as noila. Hahein Amar hektish kuva hektish. But the people who were arguing and suggested that Rebbe should have asked a question on Asham holds that it's close enough to a Kedushas Aguf. And what he explains is, what the Taklon explains is, the Hein Sover, Rebbe's Firlei, Hektish Gufei Kaddish. I'm sorry, so the first he goes, with Shimon Svirlei, Blei Nachta Kedushas Aguf, Mishum de Moisroi Bashlam. The carbon Pesach, so I apologize. The Gemara wants to know what the machalek is between Rebbe and Reb Shimon. Reb Shimon held that only the oila that you burmavish as in a keva, only that will become kaddish because it has a shaykhus to being in the keva. But the carbon Pesach, which could become a shlomim and then it's kosher with and it's kosher as in the keva, Reb Shimon held that wouldn't work. Reb Shimon didn't like Chaim Tzvi's taina, didn't like Rebbe's taina. So Zokt Gemara, the difference is Reb Shimon's sphere, Reb Shimon who says only the oila will have kedusha if you're mafresh in the keva, but not the shlomim. Hold the nafsa kedusha saguf. It doesn't get a kedusha saguf. We should the Moshe b'shlom. The fact that if a Pesach is extra, you bring it as a shlomim, that doesn't give it a kedusha saguf. The hahacha ain't gufay karav shlomim, because the guf of the animal is not brought as a shlomim. Kodama b'tmur nishtayr achar Pesach ain't a karav shlomim. Hoyle machmas kedusha psula ka'asya. Ve'itchem Pesach. So the Gemara tells us that the animal itself, Reb Shimon knows the animal itself, you will not bring as a shlomim. If you had an extra carbon Pesach, you will not bring the actual animal as a shlomim. You'll sell it, and then you'll bring with the money a shlomim. And that's why Reb Shimon said only an oila I'll accept if it's a nekeva, and it'll have kedusha, but not the carbon pesach. But Rebbe, who held that you should also say by a carbon pesach that it has a shaykhus to a nekeva, he holds Rebbe's for lehektish gufei kodesh mishum the shem shlom malay hoil vi shlom vav shlom nekeva. He holds that it's considered that the guf of the animal itself has a shaykhus to be brought as a shlomim, as a nekeva, and therefore he argued and said that even a shlomim, even a carbon pesach, if you were mafish and nekeva for a carbon pesach, it should make a tamura. Okay, now before we go weiter, the Vilna Gaon says that a shtickle Gemara on Amud Aleph belongs right over here and not on Amud Aleph. So I want to follow the Taklid. The Gemara is going to now discuss where does Reb Shimon ben Yehuda b'shem Reb Shimon, who said that both by all three, Sai and Oila, Shai and Osham, and Sai Pesach, if you were makdish, if you were mafresh, and the keva, it wouldn't make a tamur, would have no kedusha at all. What is the reasoning for that? So we're going to go to Amud Aleph, and we're going to learn the Gemara over there. But the Gemara in Amud Aleph says as follows: Chavraya b'shem Reb Yochanan. The Chavraya in the name of Reb Yochanan, Reb Ivu bar Nagri, Omar Kumi Rabbi Ila. And Reb Ivu bar Nagri said this in front of Reb Ila. B'shem Reb Yochanan, the name of Reb Yochanan is Taimer Dehen Tanya. The svara of why it has no kedusha, Sai and Oila, Sai Korban Pesach, and Sai and Osha, that you mafish in a keva, why it has no kedusha? Because it says in the pasuk, "V'im kol behema tmeya asher lo yakrivu mimenu korban lashem." The pasuk says that if you were makdish a behema tmeya, that you cannot bring it for a korban. So the halacha is v'humad v'hemed v'herech, you have to be pointed. So what is this pasuk talking about? Is it really talking about a behemoth tmeya, like a horse? Mata b'loy tmeya. It cannot be referring to a horse. You know why? Because there's already another pasuk that talks about if you're makdish a behemoth tmeya, a real non-kosher animal. And it says, of course, that you just have to be pointed by the kabayas. So this pasuk cannot be referring to exactly the same thing. So what does the pasuk over here means when it says v'eskol behemoth tmeya? Zok to Gemara, Ella afilu tmeya ba'oisei Hashem. Even if it's not kosher for this carbon, for instance, you are mafresh and nekeva, and it's supposed to be a zachar, even that, it doesn't get any kedusha at all, and you're just pointed. So that's the makor of what we said from Reb Shimon ben Yehuda, the name of Reb Shimon, that any carbon that's supposed to be a zachar, and you were mafresh it as an nekeva, such as the oila, the pesach, or the osham, it gets no kedusha at all, and therefore it's only by the kabayis, it's not a carbon itself, and it cannot make a tour. On that, Frank the Gemara, that doesn't make sense. The kasha, because the very next pasuk, which addresses what you're supposed to do with this animal, it says v'hemed v'herech. Now the hemed v'herech is a chiyuv to do on the carbon that you were mafish properly, and then the carbon got a mum. Then you have to stand it up in front of the kohen, and the kohen has to assess it. And we learn from there that if the animal was dead and cannot stand up in front of a kohen to be assessed, you're not pointed, you just bury it. So the pasuk v'hemed v'erech is clearly only referring to a carbon that in fact got kedusha saguf. So Frek the Gemara, if you want to learn that this pasuk is talking about an animal that couldn't have any type of kedusha saguf at all, and you want to bring a raya, in fact, that has no kedusha saguf at all, how are you going to explain the very next pasuk that discusses this animal that we're talking about, and it says on it v'hemed v'erech, which means you have to treat it like a carbon that got him up? And the Gemara bleibt schwer. Rabbi Zeira b'shem Rabbi Elazar lo yamar kein. Rabbi Zeira b'shem Rabbi Elazar darshan the pasuk differently, not like Rabbi Yochanan did, not to support the svara that we're saying from Rabbi Shimon that unless it's a kosher carbon, it's like a behemoth tmeya. Because it says, Ella, he learns the same pasuk, but he dashes it differently. Yom kol behemoth tmeya asher lo yakrivu mimenu carbon lashem, and we learn what does it mean? Kol she'enu royally karev loy kan v'loy b'makam acher, then it's eina oiseh tumor. A carbon that you couldn't be makriv anywhere, that cannot make a tumor. Yotus nekeva la'oila. But if you were mafish and nekeva la'oila, there afa pisha ain't really curve can, even though you can't bring this behemoth that's in the cave as an oila, royal curve makamacher. If it was a oif, you would be able to be makravit as an oila. So Reb Zira is learning from this pasuk. He's explaining from this pasuk to support the first sheet of Reb Shimon, who says that an oila that you're mafish and the cave for would have kedusha, would make it more. So on that, the Gemara asked, Rav Avun, Rav Bun, Bon Kumar Reb Zira. They had a problem with what Reb Zira just said, because Haroiva Varnirva. If you have an animal that's a roiva or a nirva, it lived with a person. That's also an example of an animal that could never ever be brought as a carbon anywhere. But we know the Allah is v'arei anoshim t'mura. If somebody was mafresh as a carbon, a roiva or a nirva, it gets enough of a kedusha that it would make it t'mura. It does get kedusha zuguf. But the way you, Reb Zira, are learning the pasuk, that if it's not good anywhere for a carbon, it wouldn't even get any kedusha, and therefore it wouldn't make a tmura, it wouldn't fit. Amar loin, so Reb Zira answered, I didn't mamish mean that it's anywhere the carv loy kav libim makamacher. I just meant afani le'amarti el tmei mamish. I just meant to exclude a tmei mamish. That's something that would not get any kedusha at all. But anything else would get a kedusha zaguf, and it would make tmura. On that, the Gemara asked the same question as we asked earlier. At the end of the day, the kasha b'daktiv emid verich. At the end of the day, this very same pasuk cannot be for taich. That's something that gets no kedusha saguf at all, because the very next pasuk once again says that you're treating it like psula mikdoshim, so your pshat can't be right in the pasuk. So what we need to extract from here, and that's why the Gra wants this Gemara to be back on their base, is that Rabbi Yochanan here is clearly using this pasuk of Mkolbei Mitmeya to tell you that even if it's merely an akeva instead of a zachar, it still totally disqualifies it from any kedusha, and therefore it wouldn't even make a tamura. That's the main information that we need to extract from here. Now let's see the Gemara back on Amud Beis, and we can continue on the Gemara on Amud Beis. Rabbi Zira b'Shem Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, Talmid Rabbi Yeshua. He wants to explain the reasoning for Rabbi Yeshua, who says that even though you're makdish it for a carbon, if it's a zocher, you'll mark it as noila. But if it's a nekeva, you have to sell it, because it says in the pasuk, "Daber el harin vel bonov vel chol bnei Yisrael v'amart aleim." You should tell them as follows: Ishish v'beis Yisrael. So let's see the pasuk inside. It says, Ishish mibeis Yisrael, minager b'Yisrael, asher Yaakov karbonoi l'chol nedreim u'l'chol nedvoisam asher yakrivu l'Hashem lo'ed. So this is saying if you were makish your nechasim, I'm sure would want to learn that this pasuk means if you were makish all of your nechasim, we'll say that the karbonos could be brought directly as an oila, like Rabbi Yeshua holds, that will say that the animals that are right to be a carbon, when you're makish your nechasim, they actually become karbonos themselves. And we learn from there, hakoil karv l'oila. Anything can be brought as an oila. It actually gets a kedusha zaguf as an oila. L'rtzoincham tamim zachar. The next pasuk says, l'rtzoinchem tamim zachar. So only if it's a zachar will you be able to bring it as a carbon. Minayin afilu nekevas. How do you know that even the kevos get a kedusha? Talmud Lemer v'bokar l'rabos as an nekevos. The next pasuk says v'bokar. It doesn't specify male. It just says v'bokar, which will include nekevos. He asked the following question. The pasuk right away before says l'tzoinchem zachar. It says right over here l'tzoinchem tamim zachar. So clearly specifies zachar, and you want to use the next word babakar to include females, even though it says specifically in the pasuk zachar. Ksiv zachar v'atamar babakar l'rabis is nekeves. If you're going to do that, then the kavasa ksiv tamim. It says tamim. V'at amrit. So why did you say the same thing? Babakar l'Rabbis Balamuman. Are you going to argue that even Balamuman are brought as karbonis? And you'll say it's lav dafka because it says babakar without specifying that the bakar is tamim. It says earlier in the pasuk it has to be tamim. So oibazoi, how could you argue that the kavis should be included? On that, the Gemara says, Rav Amar, you want to know what's the difference? Ma'abinain, you know what's the difference? Why you would not include a balmum, but you would include in the keva? Rav Amar shifted the chatchada b'nain. There's a huge difference between them. And shifted the chatchada is the piece of wood that you use to separate between the different threads on a loom, which is very obviously different. It's pashut that there's a difference. And I don't even need to explain, it's pashut that there's a difference. And the Taklin explains why there's obviously a difference between the nekeva and the balmum. So it says nekeva tamek yivenu marbinin babakar dumya the carbon she hetamin v'roy the carbonach avol l'roy babakar balimumin. But to argue that the babakar should also include balimumin loy mash maklal. That's not mustabadik at all. Come on. Mi babakar oifois the loy mishtami betevas babakar hachanami balmum loy nichlechu betamim. So what it's saying is the same way bakar for sure would not include birds, babakar for sure wouldn't have a connotation that it could be a balmum. You find when the Torah says bakar, after that it specifically says that it can't be a balmum. So therefore, bakar doesn't have a connotation to even include a balmum, but bakar might have a connotation to include on the keva, and that's why Rabbi Yeshua would make that distinction. Let's see what time it is. It's 6:50, so I guess we better stop here. I'm going to try to push. These are really difficult gemaras, and they don't go easy. But in the blot, we're going to get into very easy gemaras. The gemara is going to start discussing the different jobs that different people had in the Beis Hamikdash. And when we get up today, it'll start moving more quickly. But we still have another half a amud of more difficult gemara.
Yeah.
Have a wonderful day.
You too.